It was supposed to be a normal family dinner. Then my husband's cousin leaned forward with a smile and said a single sentence that would destroy our family. I was reading great-grandmother's diary. Did you know she adopted Grandpa? In that instant, my husband wasn't the heir to the family estate anymore. And the person who was sitting right there at the table with us. Before that night, my life looked perfect on the outside. It was beautiful, stable, and deeply rooted in tradition. I'd married into the Sterling family, a name that carried weight in our small, wealthy corner of the world. This wasn't flashy new money. It was something far more substantial. Old money. Think of it like an ancient oak tree with roots running for miles, compared to a flashy bouquet of flowers that's beautiful today, but gone tomorrow. Their wealth was anchored by the sprawling Sterlingwood estate, a magnificent property that had been the family's heart for over a century. My husband, Mark, was the living proof of that legacy. He was kind, handsome, and carried the quiet confidence of a man who knew his place in the world. He was the heir, the next in a long, unbroken line of Sterlings to inherit the estate. It wasn't just a house to him, it was the soil his entire identity was planted in. He'd grown up roaming its gardens, fishing in its private lake, and listening to stories of his ancestors in the grand wood-paneled library. The scent of old books and lemon polish wasn't just a smell. It was the air he breathed, the scent of his childhood, his future, his entire being. The estate itself was breathtaking. A long, winding driveway flanked by ancient oaks led to a Georgian-style manor that looked like it belonged in a historical drama. It had over 30 rooms, each filled with antiques that whispered stories of generations past. The centerpiece was the grand ballroom, with crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking hills that hadn't changed in 100 years. To the Sterlings, Sterlingwood wasn't just property, it was a monument to their endurance, their stability, their unbroken lineage. It was proof that they were a family that lasted. Mark's parents, Richard and Eleanor, were the current keepers of this legacy. Richard was a stern, imposing man who saw the world in black and white, in terms of duty and tradition. Eleanor was his polished, perfect wife, a woman who managed the family's social standing with the precision of a military general. They loved Mark, but their love was like an elaborate, expensive frame for a painting. It was beautiful, but it also served as a contract, dictating exactly what kind of masterpiece he was required to be. He was their son, but he was also the vessel for the family's future. His path had been laid out before he was even born. And I, as Mark's wife, had my own role to play. I was like an understudy in a grand play, learning the lines for a part I would one day inherit from Eleanor. I was expected to host flawless charity events, to always look impeccable, and to understand that the family's legacy was everything. I accepted this role willingly. I loved Mark, and his world, with all its pressures, became my own. I learned the names of every ancestor in the portrait gallery. I could tell the history of every piece of silver, and I understood that our lives were less about what we wanted and more about fulfilling a dynastic duty. We spent every other Sunday at the estate for family dinner. It was non-negotiable. It was all so orderly, so perfect. We were like a family living inside a beautiful, fragile snow globe, perfect and unchanging. It was a beautiful, gilded cage, and I didn't even realize it was a cage until the night the door was blown clean off its hinges. The stability I treasured was nothing more than a facade, a carefully constructed lie held up by a secret that was about to shatter everything. The night it all fell apart was a crisp evening in early fall. The dining room smelled of wood smoke from the fireplace, and the table was set for 8. It was Richard's birthday, which added a layer of formal festivity to our usual dinner. Mark and I were there, along with his parents, Richard and Eleanor, his Aunt Carol, and his cousin, Leo. The last 2 guests were Sarah, a distant cousin from another branch of the family, and her husband. Sarah was a quiet, unassuming woman, a kindergarten teacher who seemed almost out of place amidst the loud confidence of the Sterlings. The conversation drifted along as usual. Richard boasted about a business deal, Eleanor detailed her plans for a hospital gala, and Aunt Carol gossiped about a neighbor's tacky renovation. Mark and I chimed in when we were supposed to, playing our parts. The clinking of silverware on porcelain was the soundtrack to my life. And then there was Leo. Leo was Carol's son, a man in his late 30s whose latest obsession was genealogy. For the past 6 months, he'd been digging through the family archives. We all thought it was quaint, another one of Leo's harmless quirks. "You'll never guess what I found," Leo announced suddenly, his voice cutting through a lull in conversation. He had a giddy, triumphant look on his face, like a man bursting to share a discovery. Eleanor smiled thinly. Another thrilling story about a third cousin who sold horse carriages, Leo? Better, he exclaimed, leaning forward and putting his elbows on the pristine white tablecloth. I found great-grandmother Annalise's personal diaries. The real ones. A murmur of interest went around the table. Annalise Sterling was a family legend, the matriarch who had cemented the family's fortune. Richard grunted. Probably just filled with complaints about the staff. Some things are best left in the past, Leo. Oh, but this is history, Leo insisted, his eyes wide. He was like a child about to reveal a wonderful surprise, completely unaware he was holding a lit stick of dynamite. For instance, he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, I was reading her entry from March 1928, and this is a fun fact. Did you know she adopted Grandpa? Silence. Not a gradual quiet. It was absolute. The silence wasn't just an absence of noise, it felt like a physical object, a glass dome that had dropped over the Mont-Saint doll. Across from me, Eleanor's polite smile was frozen on her face. Richard's face, usually ruddy, had gone completely pale. But my eyes were on my husband. Mark was frozen, his eyes locked on Leo. First, I saw confusion, then disbelief, and then I saw the ground crumble beneath his feet. He looked like a man who had just discovered the compass he'd used his entire life had always been pointing south instead of north. His identity as the heir, the next in the unbroken Sterling line, it was all dissolving. And Leo, in his glee, had just taken a sledgehammer to that foundation. What? What did you just say? Mark's voice was a raw whisper. Leo, finally sensing the nuclear shift in the room, looked uncomfortable. That Grandpa was adopted. Great-grandmother Annalise writes all about it. She and her husband couldn't have children, so they adopted a baby boy in secret and passed him off as their own to protect the family line. Richard Sterling, my father-in-law, was named after his father, the man who, according to this diary, wasn't a Sterling by blood at all. Eleanor finally snapped out of her paralysis. Leo, that is quite enough. You have a morbid sense of humor. Her voice was like ice, but I could hear the panic rattling beneath it. But it's true. I have the diary, Leo whined. You will be silent, Richard roared, his voice shaking the crystal glasses. This wasn't command. This was the sound of pure, raw fear. And in that moment, I knew. I knew from Eleanor's frantic denial and Richard's terrifying rage. It was the truth. An old, buried truth that had just been carelessly dug up. The rest of the dinner is a blur. Richard stormed out. Eleanor followed, shooting a look of pure hatred at Leo. Aunt Carol started to cry, and Mark. My husband just sat there, his face a hollow mask. My eyes drifted across the table and landed on Sarah. She was sitting perfectly still, her face a picture of quiet shock. She was the great-granddaughter of Annalise Sterling's brother. If Mark's grandfather was adopted, then Mark was not the true heir by blood. The direct descendant, the rightful heir to the Sterling estate according to the century-old family charter, was Sarah, the quiet kindergarten teacher. And from the looks on Richard and Eleanor's faces as they fled, they had known it all along. The drive home was silent. It was a silence so thick you could taste it, like the air before a lightning strike. Mark drove, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. When we finally pulled into our driveway, he cut the engine. Mark, I said softly, talk to me. He finally turned to me, his eyes full of a pain so deep it stole my breath. It's a lie, he said, his voice hoarse. Dad would have told me. He would have told me. But we both knew he was trying to convince himself. His parents' reaction wasn't confusion. It was the terror of people whose darkest secret had just been dragged into the light. Discovering a family secret like this is like finding out the blueprints to your own house are a complete forgery. Every room you thought you knew suddenly feels alien and unsafe. That was the first of many sleepless nights. Mark paced our bedroom like a caged animal, swinging between furious denial and hollow despair. My whole life, he kept muttering. My entire life is built on this. It's who I am. The calls started the next morning. It was Eleanor, her voice smooth and practiced. Darling, she said, I do hope you and Mark aren't taking Leo's foolishness to heart. He's always been imaginative. Classic Eleanor. Smooth it over. Pretend it never happened. Her attempts to gaslight us only made me more determined. I'm going to find that diary, I told Mark a few days later. Mark looked at me, his eyes exhausted. Why? He asked, his voice flat. So we can find out for sure that my life is a fraud? So we can have the truth, I said firmly. We can't build a life on a lie, Mark. We build it on the truth, no matter how hard it is. Getting that diary wasn't easy. I called Leo, who was a mess of apologies. He told me Richard had forbidden him from the estate, but gave me the diary's location from his notes. I knew the staff schedule. My window was a Tuesday afternoon when Richard and Eleanor would be out. I drove to the estate, my heart hammering. I let myself in and went straight to the attic. The door was locked with a new deadbolt, but I remembered Mark telling me about a hidden access route from his great-grandmother's old suite. Inside a closet, I found a hidden panel that opened to a narrow set of stairs. The attic air was thick with the dust of a century. I found the old green steamer trunk Leo described, and inside a false bottom, 4 small, leather-bound books. Annalise Sterling's diaries. Back home, I began to read. I found the entries about her sadness over being unable to have children, and then the one Leo had mentioned. March 22nd, 1928. We have done it. We have secured our future, though on a great deception. Today we brought him home. A perfect, beautiful baby boy. The records are sealed. To the world, this child was born to me. We have named him Richard. He is a Sterling now. He will never know he is not of our blood. It is a necessary sin. Reading those words was like finding the single loose thread that, when pulled, would unravel the entire family tapestry. There it was. Mark's grandfather was adopted. But it didn't end there. I found another passage from a year later that made my blood run cold. February 4th, 1929. My brother Thomas visited today. He knows of our arrangement. I saw the way he looked at his own child, his true-blooded Sterling daughter, and then at my Richard. He knows that his line, not mine, is now the true Sterling line. My son is the heir in name. His daughter and her children are the heirs in blood. Thomas, Sarah's grandfather. I closed the last diary. The entire family legacy was a lie, actively hidden by Richard and Eleanor. They had knowingly pushed their son to be the heir when he had no legitimate claim. This was no longer just about Mark's identity. It was about justice. I knew what I had to do. I was going to call a family meeting, and I was going to burn their perfect, gilded world to the ground. I showed Mark the diaries. I watched his face grow paler as he read his great-grandmother's words. The denial finally shattered, replaced by a quiet, chilling anger. They knew, he said, his voice low and dangerous. My parents knew this whole time. I nodded. Yes, they knew. They let me believe it, he continued, his voice trembling with rage. They pushed it on me. For what? For the name? For the house? We're going to make it right, I said. He looked at the diaries, then back at me. A new resolve hardened his features. No, he said. We are going to make it right. The confrontation had to be on our terms. I booked a private conference room at a hotel and sent a single, cryptic email to the family. A matter of urgent family importance has arisen. Your presence is required. They all came. Richard and Eleanor, annoyed, Aunt Carol and a terrified Leo, and Sarah and her husband, looking deeply uncomfortable. Mark and I stood at the head of the table. In front of us lay Annalise's diaries. What is the meaning of this, Mark? Richard boomed. Mark looked at his father with eyes that were no longer warm and familiar, but cold and hard as river stones. No, Dad. We're doing this here because for the past 40 years, you and Mom have been lying. Eleanor gasped. How dare you? Done for me? Mark cut her off. Or done to me? You raised me to believe I was the heir to Sterlingwood. You knew it wasn't true. That is a vicious lie, Richard snarled. Is it? I said, opening the top diary. Because great-grandmother Annalise seems to disagree. I began to read the entries aloud. This is private family history, Richard finally managed. It changes nothing. Your grandfather was raised a Sterling. Except in blood, Mark said flatly. And the family charter, the one you always lectured me about, is very specific. The estate passes to the eldest direct blood descendant. That isn't me. I picked up another diary, and Annalise knew it. So did her brother, Thomas. I read the passage about Thomas's visit and his true-blooded daughter. Sarah let out a small gasp. You're tearing this family apart over some scribbles in an old book, Eleanor said. her voice shaking. No, I said, looking right at her. You tore this family apart when you chose to live a lie. You let Mark build his entire life on a falsehood. You let Sarah, the true heir, live her life never knowing what was rightfully hers. Why? Richard slammed his hand on the table. Because it was our duty. My father was a Sterling. It was Mark's right. We couldn't just hand everything over to them. He gestured vaguely at Sarah. Hand it over or give it back? Mark asked. You were afraid of losing the status. So you stole it. You stole Sarah's birthright. All eyes turned to Sarah. I don't understand, she whispered. This ends now, Mark said. He looked at his parents. The legacy you were so obsessed with, it's not even yours, and I won't be a part of it anymore. He then walked around the table to Sarah. He knelt, bringing himself to her eye level. That single gesture of humility was more powerful than all of Richard's booming commands. It was like watching a king willingly lay his crown at the feet of the rightful queen. Sarah, he said softly, I know this is a shock, but according to these diaries and the family charter, Stirlingwood is yours. It always has been. Sarah just stared at him, tears welling in her eyes. But I'm a teacher, she stammered. I don't know anything about running an estate. You'll learn, Mark said with a small smile, and we'll help you if you'll have us. You can't be serious, Eleanor shrieked. You would just give away your entire future to her? Mark stood and faced his mother, his face a mask of stone. It's not mine to give away. It never was. I'm not giving away my future, Mom. I'm finally getting one that's my own. One that isn't based on a lie. The fight was over. Richard and Eleanor just stood there, defeated. They had lost. Not just the estate, but their son. In the days that followed, the Sterling family shattered. Richard and Eleanor retreated to the estate, sending frigid emails through their lawyer. It was a hollow threat. They knew we had the diaries. The real challenge was Sarah. She was completely overwhelmed. I can't do this, she said to us. This isn't my world. You're not taking anything, Mark told her gently. You're accepting what is rightfully yours. We want you to. We met with her, and slowly, her fear was replaced by a quiet determination. The legal process was straightforward. The diaries were primary evidence. The transfer of Stirlingwood proceeded without a fight. Richard and Eleanor were allowed to stay for a transitional period, but they were ghosts in a house that no longer belonged to them. Their relationship with Mark was severed. They saw his integrity as the ultimate betrayal. For Mark, it was a heartbreaking loss, but also a liberating one. The immense weight of their expectations was finally gone. He was like a ship that had been forced to sail a predetermined course for years, finally allowed to chart its own path into open water. Aunt Carol apologized. Leo, mortified, offered to dedicate his skills to helping Sarah piece together the family history. But the most beautiful part was Sarah. She rose to the occasion with a grace that stunned everyone. She didn't fire the staff. She gave them raises. Her first major act was to establish a foundation in great-grandmother Annalise's name, providing educational grants and support for families navigating adoption. She was using her power to honor the spirit of the woman whose secret had changed her life. About 6 months later, we were invited to dinner at the estate. Richard and Eleanor were gone, moved to a condo in Florida. As we drove up the familiar driveway, the air felt lighter. Sarah greeted us at the door, transformed. She stood taller, her quiet demeanor now a calm confidence. We ate in the massive kitchen, laughing as we cooked together. Later, we sat on the veranda, watching the sunset. You know, Sarah said to Mark, I found something else in Annalise's diary, an entry from late in her life. She wrote about her deep regret. She said the lie had been a splinter in her soul her entire life. She hoped that one day God would find a way to make things right. Sarah smiled. I think she would be happy, Mark. I think this is what she would have wanted. Looking at my husband, I saw a peace in his eyes I had never seen before. He had lost an inheritance, but gained himself. He was no longer Mark Sterling, the heir. He was just Mark, my husband, a good man building his own life, free from the gilded cage of the past. We weren't the perfect family from the photograph anymore. We were something realer and far more beautiful. We were a messy, living photograph, full of authentic smiles and real connections. We learned that a legacy isn't about bloodlines or buildings. It's about the choices you make and the future you build with your own two hands. And that was a foundation that could never be broken.
Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If you enjoyed it, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. Don't forget to press the bell icon for updates. Until next time, take care.